I've been dealing with Texas water for 36 years. Of course, I started when I was 2 and have learned a great deal over the years. Based on our discussions, let me make a few points and then we'll turn it over to our speakers. One of the things that's really interesting, and we've observed for a long time, we know water, surface and groundwater are connected, but our laws and institutions are not necessarily in sync with this connectivity. And we heard this morning a discussion on the Rio Grande. And in 2014, I led a class to study the Rio Grande master's and PhD students. We spent one semester having all the experts come in and talk about issues on the Rio Grande from the headwaters to the Gulf. And then we spent 2 weeks traveling the route of the Rio Grande. Interestingly enough, it was 3 seasons in 2 weeks. So it snowed on us in Colorado, we had springtime in New Mexico, and by the time we parked the bus on the beach and walked down to the mouth of the Rio Grande, it was hotter than Hades. But one of the things we learned, in being in the state of Colorado, all our irrigation ditches are sand lined. So over the last 4 or 5 years, they've come together, the irrigators, and they've created a special fund to retire irrigation water rights, so there will be sufficient water flowing in the Rio Grande so they can satisfy their delivery to New Mexico and the treaty. We were in New Mexico and had a chance to be in the Mesilla Valley. In that area, it's peppers as well as pecan trees. We went inside Elephant Butte Dam, really an interesting experience. But we stood in a pecan orchard 50 yards from the river. The Rio Grande was bone dry. An irrigator, one of the farmers, turned on his well and a prodigious amount of water spurted from that well. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where that water's coming from if everything goes through a sand ditch. And so New Mexico has known about this connectivity, and that's what the law is about. When the treaties and compacts were negotiated, we looked at surface water. But over time, we now have a connectivity. The challenge is how our institutions deal with that. The other interesting thing, we talked about droughts and floods, tell the story of water in Texas. There's a third dimension, and it's been touched on here. It's population growth. Imagine the drought of the 50s, we had 9 million people. The drought of 2020, we may have, no, I'm not predicting that, we may have 29 to 30 million people. So the consequences of population growth are very profound in the state. And the pressures are felt at the local level. We recognize water and water policy is a state issue, but the burden falls at the local level for infrastructure, for water, wastewater systems. And if you look at some of the hot spots, think of the I-35 corridor, ladies and gentlemen, the development and the growth that's occurred from Waco south to San Antonio. The reality is most of the surface water is allocated, so where is this new growth going to come from? It's going to come predominantly from groundwater, and it's going to create tremendous urban, rural kinds of pressures. We also think about groundwater sources. We're fortunate to talk about the Ogallala. 2/3 of the groundwater we pump in this state really comes from the Ogallala, and it produces 4 very important cash crops: cotton, corn, sorghum, and wheat. So it really is the lifeblood for agriculture, not only in the Panhandle, but in other parts of the state. One of the lessons we learned from much of the legislation, starting with Senate Bill 1 that Senator Brown will talk about, is asking the legislature, we can't ask them to solve complex problems, we ask them to ratify solutions the parties have worked out. And so big legislation really needs to bring together stakeholders to spend some time talking about trade-offs, compromise, to come up ultimately with an issue and a solution. So let me just hit some highlights, and we'll expand. So we have a huge amount of groundwater in this state. Much of it is brackish. The scientists, the engineers who will develop the technology at low energy cost to turn that into fresh water will make millions, and it will certainly solve many of our problems. Rural to urban transfers of groundwater are going to continue. Rural areas are extensively at risk for drought. I worry about the capacity of groundwater districts to deal with present and future litigation. And I think about the litigation patterns. The early cases dealt with, did I get a permit? Will I get a permit? More recently, it's transferring groundwater. The new litigation will be over the desired future condition or drainage issues, where a district issues a permit to one party, there's a landowner next to that party that doesn't have a well, that water migrates. It's the role of districts in dealing with those drainage issues. So that's what we're looking at in some of the future. So we're fortunate to have the godfather of water and groundwater in Texas, Senator Brown, who was instrumental in...
Maybe it's the grand-godfather.
Grand-godfather, okay. Really instrumental in working through Senate Bill 1 and Senate Bill 2, which when we talk about regional water planning, you're looking at the gentleman who had the lead in the Senate in putting together that legislation. We also have two current representatives who are in interesting hotspot. I call them hotspots. So if we go to the area west of San Antonio, it's a hotspot in terms of some of the kinds of issues that have evolved over surface water and groundwater. If we go to West Texas, I call it a hotspot because we're in drought, and that seems to be an important issue. So with that, let me introduce Senator Brown.
Thank you very much, Ron, and it's a pleasure to be here and to join my two colleagues. What are y'all? You're not my colleagues now, are you?
Subject.
That's right. But remember, when it comes to the questions, they have a vote, and I don't. So keep that in mind. I'm pleased to be here, and Ed asked me to talk about Senate Bill 1. When I first started, I guess first campaign I was running, I stopped in a little cafe down along the coast where my district was, from Houston down to Corpus. And as usual, went in to meet everybody in there and shaking hands and introduced myself, asking them to vote for me. And the waitress said, be sure and ask the man over there in the corner, today's his birthday. And I walked over, and he was an older gentleman. And I introduced myself, said, happy birthday. He said, thank you. I said, how many birthdays? He said, 93. I said, wow, that is something. I said, how long have you lived in this area? He said, all my life. I was born half a mile down the road. And I said, I bet you've seen a lot of changes take place in your lifetime. He said, yep, and I've been against every damn one of them. And so when Governor Bullock called me in the beginning of the 1997 session and said, I want you to carry a water bill, and we need a water plan for Texas. Said the Water Development Board has issued its report, and we are in bad shape following the drought of '95. And he said, but don't get excited about it, because we've tried three or four times before to pass one, and they all fail. And I said, why? He said, regionalism, parochialism. Nobody trusts the other parts of the state. And I thought about that man in the coffee shop when he said that. And so I said, well, you don't mind if I try to pass it? And he said, no, give it a try, but just don't be disappointed that if it takes you 3 sessions to get it done. Well, I took his advice on why they failed to begin with, and right at the start, we made clear to all the interests this was not going to be a bill that had top-down planning, top-down regulation. that the state was not going to become the water commission itself and run things for all the locals. And we came up with the idea of water planning with 16 regions, which satisfied their concerns, and we convinced them that we were telling the truth. And so that was the hallmark of that Senate Bill 1, was the regional planning process, because it allowed local people to be involved in developing the future needs of that district and identifying what those needs were and where the water was going to come from. And then the Water Development Board, of course, would put that into a single plan. We looked at, there's a great deal of pressure on us from people wanting us to do away with the rule of capture and replace it with correlative rights or some other form of system. And gave it some thought, not a lot of thought, but gave it some thought that if we tried to do that amidst all that we were doing in Senate Bill 1, it would kill the bill, probably never get out of the Senate. And so we decided that we were going to look at the rule of capture and look at groundwater districts and make the policy statement that groundwater districts, if the groundwater is going to be regulated, the preferred method is to regulate it through local groundwater districts. And that was a policy decision we made. I think there were 25 groundwater districts at that time, and I think there are 98 now. And so that sentence, I think, helped create a little interest in creating groundwater districts. The aim, of course, the thought was that they would be drawn based upon aquifers, or minor parts of aquifers that were identifiable as a source of water that would be manageable by that groundwater district. It didn't turn out that way. We had people coming. I remember one county judge came before the committee, Natural Resources, and I said, "You want a groundwater district?" He said, "I sure do." I said, "Why do you want this?" He said, "Well, my two neighboring counties got one. I figured I ought to get one too." And I said, "Well, what is the aquifer that you're talking about?" "Well, we haven't looked at that," and it demonstrated that the idea was, at that moment, the idea was that if they had a groundwater district that matched their county lines, they could keep water from moving out of that county into the next county. And of course, we made it very clear in the statute that you can't stop the water, you can't prohibit water from being exported from one groundwater district out of the groundwater district. But that didn't change, and I know that there have been attempts since that time to try to encourage the groundwater districts to consolidate, to go together with planning, to try to make it more aquifer-oriented as a more efficient way of regulating that subsurface water. We haven't got there yet because we still have an abundance of groundwater. I will say that the rule of capture is almost gone as a practical matter, because we have 92% of the groundwater district, the groundwater covered by groundwater districts. And so there are limitations on the pumping of water that will protect the neighbor who also is in that groundwater district. And so it's not as dark as you see it reported on television, that we live in a state where everybody gets to pump all they want to every day out of the groundwater. Well, that's just not a fact. But I guess the real, we passed Senate Bill 1, we had planning, we had emphasis on groundwater districts, and I guess the real rat in the closet turned out to be junior rights. And, I read an article, I was looking through some articles yesterday, just refreshing my memory about things, and one article said, "And the junior rights provision, which was passed by Senator Brown," and I read that, and I thought, now, isn't that something? I know it's only been 20 years ago, but that was one of the most highly contested issues of Senate Bill 1 was the junior rights provision. And for those of you that weren't born in 1997, that provided that in our river system where we take our surface water, it's based upon seniority of permitting. The oldest permit is the most valuable. It's the last one to be cut off in case of drought. And so this rule that went on in the House said that if you sell that right to move it outside the basin that it's in, then it becomes the most junior in the system, which of course changes the value completely. And you know, it's not an arguable statement that I think there were like 100 and some odd interbasin transfers before '97, and I think there maybe have been one or two since that time, but it has had a chilling effect on moving surface water. Senate Bill 2, which was passed later, focused on conjunctive use. In other words, that if we're going to have good water planning where we're going to try to meet the needs of the state, we have to look at both surface water and groundwater. Now, Lieutenant Governor Bullock was a wise man. He gave a lot of good advice and you know, did a great job as Lieutenant Governor. But he told me when I went in and I said, okay, we're down to one amendment. This is the day before that we had to pass the bill out of committee, the conference committee. I said, we're down to one amendment, that's the junior rights. And he said, you got to take it. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, he said, we have to have this bill. It's too important to the planning of water for the future. We have to start right now. We got to pass this. He said, besides, every 2 years, there's a turnover. And he said, 2 years from now, you can amend that bill and take that out and there'll not be a problem. And it's still there. So that's one of the issues that I think has to be addressed at some point in our management of water for the future. Doesn't mean take all the water from one river authority. It just means we have to remove that ban on moving that water and work with groundwater districts so that we can have that conjunctive use. I think that the groundwater districts, in my opinion, started out immediately as a political group. They formed an alliance, and all of a sudden they were a very strong factor down at the legislature, and they didn't want to make any changes in the rules that were put into place at the beginning with Senate Bill 1. I think they have matured quite a bit over the last 20 years. I don't mean the people that are the commissioners, but we have, some of us have, but I think they've matured as a body and have started working more together with all the other water interests in the state to try to help develop water for the good of the state. And in other words, they still have a role to play with their local constituencies, but they're also looking to see how groundwater districts can help provide for water for the future. And that's a very positive outcome. I think that we, if I had any advice to give to my two colleagues on the right, which I know they're always anxious to hear advice from former members, I would say we have to look back at the attitude of people that were around when Senate Bill 1 was passed, and they came together. They came together. I was a mediator by training in part of my law practice, and I knew that there would be differences, but we had about 70 meetings before we drafted a bill to bring together opposite sides on issues and resolve those issues before they got into the bill, knowing full well that if we filed a bill, we would have all those people against it, and it's hard to undo all that anti-bill once it's identified as a bad bill. But we were able to do that, and people came together because they knew we needed that water for the future in that water planning. The other part is that when when industry, or like saws as an example, is an innovative entity with with their ASR and their brackish, and when people come to the legislature with ideas about how to better do what we're doing as far as water, then try real hard to make it attractive for those type of things to be implemented, instead of saying, well, you know, some people, these don't do that, but some people will say, well, I don't know if we want to give that kind of authority or not. Help them work it through and try new things, because that's how we're going to get our issues developed in a way that benefits all of us. And so I appreciate being here, and I know that we got a lot of good future. We got great people here who are interested in water, and I think that that's a good benefit for the people of Texas. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes, sir.
Now, I know you have lots of war stories from Senate Bill 1, but we won't have you repeat all of them here. But there's some really interesting discussion and debate. Representative Tracy King is our next speaker. His resume and background are in your packet. I think what really jumps out at the service you've had to the state and to constituencies, certainly to agriculture, natural resources, water. You've been a key player in working through all of these areas and being an advocate for that. And you're in an interesting part of the state, being west of San Antonio, having interesting groundwater resources, and many people discovering that and wanting them. So, Representative King, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kaiser. I appreciate you having us here today, and it's always a pleasure to be with Chairman Price and Senator Brown, or Senator Corleone, I guess now, the Godfather. It was, I was in the legislature when they did Senate Bill 1, and we were talking about it earlier. Senator Brown asked me, he said if I was there, and I said, yeah, I was there in '97, but I wasn't on the conference committee because I wouldn't support the water tax that the House sponsor had, Chairman Lewis, and so he said, well, I kind of need that, and I said, well, you're not getting it from me. And so we still don't have a water tax today,
No,
do
that's
we?
right.
And it's been floated. You know, we've had toilet taxes and sales taxes and everything else, and it had never made it. But you did a great piece of work on that bill. And I was thinking about when you were telling the story. When I came to the legislature in 1995, I was elected from a district, and I had one job, and that was to kill Senate Bill 1477 that created the Edwards Aquifer Authority. And I was a miserable failure at it, obviously. And it had been created in 1993 over the objections of the constituents I represented. And then there was lawsuits, imagine that, and the appointed board was thrown out and because it violated the Voting Rights Act. And so in 1997 we had another bite at the apple, and because they had to come up with a different type of board. And the appointed board, which is still in place today with a couple of appointments to it, but they're non-voting members, the appointment ones are. And so they created a 15-member board. And so those of us in our part of the world, and quite candidly, nearly all your groundwater districts and rural type folks were opposed to the bill. And of course it passed. And it was a classic situation of, I tell people that it was a wonderful political solution to a hydrological and endangered species problem. And you know, we had to pass the bill. The federal government came in, they said that there was some species, there are some species in the San Marcos Springs and that area in Comal that needed to be protected, blind salamanders. And of course, my story when I was in the coffee shop, when I was running, is I met an old guy, and he said, I can solve this problem, Tracy. He said, I don't have long to live in this world. I'm going to go pour some chemicals and kill all of them salamanders, and they can send me to prison, and I don't care. And we'll be done. It'll be over. And we won't have to worry about it anymore. And you don't even have to pay me very much. And I said, well, I don't want to have this conversation anymore. And so we didn't do that, obviously. And although a bunch of them did disappear from the lab here a while back somehow. But so that was Senate Bill 1477. And I will say, even though we were opposed to it, The men and women that have served on that board of the Edwards Aquifer Authority have done a wonderful job putting in place a bill that I believed had some basic flaws. And there's no doubt that if you had not had the hammer of the endangered species hanging over your head and you just wanted to create a water district for those counties that were used the Edwards underground water, you would have created, I think, a much different district than the one that you ended up creating. Mm-hmm. And the irony is that even the people that got wealthy selling water were opposed to the bill when it was created, because they were farmers and they wanted to be able to farm and use the water that they needed, and they thought that that would keep them from doing that. So I got one of the soundest pieces of advice. I got a phone call from somebody who was just legendary in the groundwater business, and he's passed on now. And he called me up one day during that fight, and he said, look, you don't know me and I don't know you, but the speaker thinks a lot of you. And he said, I know you got a degree in engineering and agriculture engineering, and you're going to be looking at this from a hydrological and geological standpoint and water district standpoint. And they called me in during '93 to look at this and come up with some solutions, and they didn't like my answers, and I was dismissed, and they're going to dismiss you too, by the way. And he said, and I just don't want you to get too upset about it. And that brings us to the legislative process. And unfortunately, as Senator Brown said, he had to accept junior water rights. And I voted for junior water rights. I was reluctant to, but you got to understand the politics at the time in the House were pretty tough. And we had some pretty strong personalities that supported junior water rights. But, you know, you can spend all day trying to attain the, you know, losing the possible in pursuit of the perfect. I mean, that's an old expression. And, you know, the purpose of this conference today is to talk about understanding the political constraints, and that is it. And that is the hardest thing for the people out in the country to understand, is that you can't get everything you want every single time. And you created all those groundwater districts, single water districts, and I have people come to me all the time and say, well, Tracy, why didn't y'all create a district that encompassed the whole dadgum aquifer, or even the minor aquifer? And I say, well, you know, dang, why didn't we? I guess if we, you know, if it was that easy, we'd have done it. And I said, but it wasn't that easy to create that. Well, you could barely get them to agree to a water district back there when they were doing it. And by the time I got to the legislature, all the easy ones had been done. And we just had the hard ones. And then the hardest one was probably Kinney County. You know, you were there when we did Kinney County.
Yes, sir.
And somebody asked me, so why hadn't they done a groundwater district in Val Verde County? I said, because it's one of the real hard ones. And we hadn't got there yet. So you have to deal. Senator Armbruster had one of the best quotes one time I read in the newspaper when he said, somebody was asking him, and the reporter said, well, you know, the reality is this, Senator Armbruster. And he said, well, I know. But he said, we don't have the luxury of dealing with reality, only the perception of reality at that time. And I think that goes right in with what you're saying. And you know, you look back, and I've always been a defender of groundwater conservation districts because I think they have a wonderful role, and as time evolves, Senator Brown is absolutely right. Their thought processes have evolved, as have thought processes of others. And I worked a great deal behind the scenes on the property rights bill, and I don't remember the bill number now that was passed, but it was in the Senate, and Troy Fraser had it in the Senate, and the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee from Ritter from Nederland, he said, Tracy, he said, we need to go to this meeting. I need you to go with me. I said, what is it? He said, this is property rights bill again. And I said, okay. And we got in the meeting, and we started talking for a little while, and I love Troy Fraser to death, but that wasn't necessarily his bellwether issue. And so, as you know, and you know, it was your issue. It was your type of issue. And so pretty soon, we were doing the deal, and we walked out, and the Farm Bureau and the cattle raisers and everybody was there, and we left. We went back to the office, and Ritter looks at me and he says, well, you got a lot of work to do, Tracy. And we did that bill, and I passed that bill, and Alan passed the bill, and we did the work on it, and we got the compromises. And a lot of people said, well, it didn't really have much, and I'll be dang if it wasn't the first thing that was cited in the big lawsuit against Edwards Aquifer recently, and the judges cited it. And so it didn't necessarily work for groundwater districts, but I worked on it because I thought it was the right thing to do. But I look forward to answering any questions that anybody has today. So thank you so much for having us.
Our next speaker is Representative Forprice from another part of the state, in this case the Panhandle, in the midst of a drought. This area, we've heard about the Ogallala Aquifer, which is the grandperson of all aquifers in Texas. Approximately 2/3 of the groundwater we pump in this state and use comes from that aquifer. There are concerns about long-range projection. What will it look like? What impact will it have for farmers? And Representative Price has served on water issues, dealt with water issues. We look forward to his thoughts on water in Texas.
Thank you, Dr. Kaiser. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I want to thank Senator Brown and Chairman King for all the guidance that they have provided. The only person, I guess, at this table that's not responsible for junior water rights. So if y'all take anything away from my comments here, you may want to remember that. But I'm really happy to be here. I was first elected in 2010 and was fortunate enough to be appointed to the Natural Resources Committee my first session back in 2011. I served on that committee for that cycle, then moved on, was not reappointed to that committee, unfortunately, so I went without serving on it for 2 cycles and then was reappointed to that committee last cycle. And it's been a tremendous experience. One of the most refreshing things about working on it, and this segment, I guess, is entitled Understanding Political Constraints. And so it's almost an impossibility to do that, but there are some realities that exist. And working on that committee, one of the things is it's not always, a partisan deal when it comes to water. Everybody is very interested in water and interested in how it impacts their districts, respectively, in the state of Texas, but it's not a Republican versus Democrat thing. Often it's an urban versus a rural thing, or there's components to surface water versus groundwater, and how folks view the ownership of it and how it's going to be managed and developed. And so it's been refreshing to work on something that is probably about as policy intensive an issue as any issue that we deal with in the entire legislature. So I'm really happy to be here and really thrilled to be asked to be here. I knew it was going to be important. We all have these stories. I guess you've heard a couple, but I just am fresh off in an election. And this woman, serious, she wasn't old, Senator Brown, like the fella you mentioned. She was younger, and she was angry and quite upset with me for something. And she said, listen, I wouldn't vote for you if you were St. Peter at the pearly gates. So I looked at her and I said, well, if I were St. Peter at the pearly gates, ma'am, you would not live in my district. So we got off to a good start. But she was unhappy. But anyway, I knew it was important when I was first elected, and the reason I mentioned when I was elected back in 2010, I don't think the primary election had been over, 4-6 weeks when Steve Walthour came to visit me in my office, and I didn't even know what a groundwater conservation district was. But he educated me, and Steve, I want to thank you for that, because ever since then you've been incredibly accessible to my staff and our office and been a source of good information. I'm really blessed to live in a part of the state that has really fantastic water folks. C.E. Williams, to name another one, is up there, and really, really fantastic with respect to how they manage their districts and the resources that they provide legislators. And you have a respect at the Capitol that is broader than just House District 87. So when you come to the Capitol and you visit with our committee members and you make your points understood and known, it has a very, very profound impact. So I say that because, one, I want to thank you publicly, but two, just the value of communicating to the members not only on that committee but to those who serve you respectively, I think is sometimes ignored, or at least mistakenly unproductive, or something that you wouldn't view as being all that useful, but it is, and I can't tell you how much I value that. I've got all of 3 slides that I'm going to share with you since it's 4:40, and this is the first one, so it's just a title, so that's number 1. Number two, and A&M, let me tell you this. This is a slide that I started using back in 2011, the worst one-year drought on record. And the reason I started using it is because if you click on this link, which I can't do right now, A&M security is so good, it's not going to allow anything embedded with Las Vegas in the title to be communicated to you this afternoon. So this slide's a lot better when it works, but we've all seen the federal debt ticker. So you see that, national debt ticker that's just constantly going, and it's going, out of control, and this is constantly turning. Well, this, I guess the Las Vegas Sun-Times it's probably not high on the appreciation list with the Chamber of Commerce in Las Vegas, but they've got a ticker that's going the opposite way. And it is the number of days until Las Vegas runs out of water. They are reliant on Lake Mead, and it is, depleting pretty quickly. And so right now, if you click on that link, and you can probably do it if you're on a cell network, but it'll show you that it's about 1,065 days. That's not very long. And so it is interesting because you often see that quote from Ben Franklin that says, when the well's dry, we will know the worth of water. Well, I think the folks in Las Vegas are paying attention to that, and I think that if we had something like that, especially where I live, with the Ogallala Aquifer, with the heavy pressure that's on it, with the demands that are on it, and we need to be able to reasonably use the water that's in there because we are such a heavy irrigated agriculture area, the state that produces food for not just the state of Texas, but the entire country. We've got tremendous energy activity up there, and our municipalities are growing, and there's manufacturing as well. So I mean, surely that's of significance, not just to me, but to the entire state, to our economy, and what's going on. But it is interesting because back in 2011, the legislature came together after that. We certainly heard during the interim in 2012, and I recognize many faces in here that came to testify. I'm sure Chairman King does too. It was pretty scary. We had communities talking about how they were trucking water in. We had communities, I remember the city of Groesbeck, the mayor came and was talking about how devastating this was going to be for their hospital and their schools and their communities, and certainly there was bottled water tax talk and a lot of different issues back then because the legislature functions pretty well when there is a gun to its head and it has to do something. But any time that it doesn't have to do something, it's really easy for that political body to say, well, we'll get to that in 2 years, or there's other issues that are more important, and there was nothing more important than water back in 2011 and 2012. So when 2013 rolled around and the session started, we worked on lots of reform bills. The historic House Bill 4 was passed, Chairman Ritter's bill, that really created the SWIP fund, and I'm really thankful that we did that. Now, had we waited 2 years or 4 years back then, we would have had Hurricane Harvey, even though the Panhandle is in a drought, in a severe drought. That's my third slide. You look at the Drought Mantra, the severe drought covers the upper 20, really most of the upper 26 counties of the Panhandle and down into the South Plains. And the prospects aren't getting that much greater. We may not have a lot of relief anytime soon, so had we waited and said we're going to push this thing down the road, yes, we'd see the starting of another severe drought trend, and we would have had Hurricane Harvey, and no one would be thinking that we need to do anything about drought conditions and what that looks like. And so politically, it's very, timing is everything in some respects. And so the stars had kind of aligned back in 11 and 12 to do something. And certainly you didn't have to go far from the Capitol to see how devastating it was. You could go out to Lake Travis, Lake Buchanan. You could see the folks that owned property out there, that had businesses out there, and it was quite devastating. And then on top of that, we had really oppressive heat, and we had wildfires, and we had lots going on at the very same time that was devastating to a lot of the businesses and industries across Texas. So that was one time where, again, it didn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. If you're on House Natural Resources and you wanted to work to solve kind of our drought response and maybe improve our infrastructure and do some things that were really positive at the time. That's when I felt like we really did come together and work very well. Some of the questions that come up a lot, especially with respect to the district I represent, centers around groundwater. Heck, we don't even know what surface water is up in the Panhandle. We haven't seen it in so long that we don't know. But it is all groundwater based, and it's all centered really on the Ogallala, and so that's kind of the questions I get. What's going to happen? You know, what are y'all going to do, if anything? Now, most of the folks that work in and around groundwater conservation districts in the Panhandle that I talk to, and most of the folks that pay attention to these issues, prefer that we don't do anything most of the time. They like things the way they are with some predictability, and certainly there's areas that they feel like could use some improvement, but they get real nervous anytime the legislature goes into session and folks say they want to start fooling with the water code. But there were a few bills last session that I just wanted to bring up because I think even though they didn't pass, they were vetoed, they were certainly indicative of the kind of, I guess, emphasis and focus that we will see in the upcoming session, and certainly maybe in the upcoming few sessions. Three of the bills that I mentioned real quickly was House Bill 2943 by Chairman Larson, and that would have required, I see Kathleen Jackson out here in the audience, the Texas Water Development Board to establish rules to promote the acquisition of conservation easements for eligible applicants through their Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I thought that was a really good idea, and I was sorry that didn't pass because 97% of the state's under private ownership. This would have been a good thing for private lands, the preservation of that water for future use and water quality. I think that was an area that I'd like to see pursued again, and I'm quite confident that it will be. House Bill 3991 would have authorized TCEQ to increase permits for existing water right holders for unpermitted flood flows and water that would otherwise have been evaporated. We heard earlier, I caught the tail end of the panel before talking about just the power of evaporation during the time of drought and oppressive heat. Well, I mean, it is pretty dramatic. And so when you look back over time, we certainly have, been innovative in the past. And I think some of these ideas will come back. And I know Chairman Larson, especially if he's chairman of Natural Resources again, will, on the House side, really want to press innovation. You can't have a 5-minute conversation with Chairman Larson without the words aquifer storage and recovery, or, heck, he'll talk about desalination of brackish water, and he's right. Back in the 60s, the Corps of Engineers did a study about diverting the Mississippi water flows to the state of Texas. And if you look at that study, one of the interesting things about it was even back in the 60s, they said this is totally possible. Now, number one, it's interesting now because where those reservoirs would have been located are huge municipalities that didn't exist back then but exist today. So it would be weird to see what that would have looked like had that actually been developed. But the things that they said in that report, one of the conclusions was this is doable. The two big impediments are politics and money. And, well, you could take that language and just right now today just about say no matter what innovation we want to talk about and no matter what policy modification we want to make, most of the time it does in many cases boil down to where the resource is going to come from and what are the politics involved. One of the other bills was House Bill 3987, and that would have created a sub-account of the State Participation Fund called the State Participation Fund 2. Not super original there, but solely for state participation in seawater desal plants and the work on that. And that would have been great. And I didn't hear the earlier panel, and I heard that it was, or one of them today, that there were some controversial things maybe said, and that's kind of what these conferences are for, to sometimes get into some areas that maybe makes folks uncomfortable. I don't know. It seems like our job makes folks uncomfortable. But the reality, too, is there was a bill last session that a lot of groundwater conservation districts, I think, didn't like, because I think I heard from, not 98 of them, Senator, but close to it, which was Senate Bill 862, I think is 862, Senator Perry's bill, talking about the attorney's fees, provision and making that, leveling the playing field, I think, as he put it, to allow for that. And so that bill passed out of the Senate but didn't pass out of the House committee. It was left pending in committee. And what that would have done was allow, you know, private landowners to recover their attorney's fees in litigation with GCDs. And, you know, I think we heard from a lot of groundwater conservation districts that would chill maybe their decisions in some regulatory actions that they needed to take. And so there was a lot of controversy about that back in the session. But folks really dug in on that issue. So I would not be at all surprised to see something like that come up again. And really, you know, looking forward into the future with the brackish water, I've mentioned that earlier. I just want to mention it again because I think it was stated up here, we have a lot of groundwater, we have a lot of brackish groundwater, over 2 billion acre feet statewide. And when we look at, you know, some options for dealing with drought, and when we look at options for taking some pressure off of some of our aquifers now, and when we look at the state's population, Dr. Kaiser, you said it could be 30 million, and it sure could be. We're well over 28 now. So it's not going to be that long before we get there. I heard our state demographer not that long ago talk about the population doubling by the year 2050. If that puts us above 50 million people statewide, that sounds like a lot of folks, and it is, and it sounds almost impossible. And somebody pointed out to me that it was in the 70s when we were a little over 12 million people. So, you know, that wasn't that long ago that we went from 12 to now 28, so it's not impossible to think we're going to go from 28 to 50 or more than 50 here in the next 30 years. And so with that kind of change, I can't imagine that we'll be able to keep up and actually manage the water that we have and do the job we need to do without economically looking at brackish water. So taking the pressure off of that will be interesting. So, you know, that we need to look at that. We need to look at aquifer storage and recovery. And I'm not just the mouthpiece for the chairman, but I think it's true. And certainly water loss through evaporation is significant. So these are the innovations I think that make the most sense. So when I was looking forward or looking at my notes, you know, over what we really focused on, even though a lot of this did not pass, I think it is foreshadowing for what's going to come up in the future. You know, more regulatory certainty, permitting procedures, GCD performance. I wrote down planning and I guess better planning coordination between regions and innovation. The chairman always says, you know, if we fail to plan, we're planning to fail, and I think there's some truth to that. So we will look at that. Some of the uncertainties as we go forward. The House Natural Resources Committee, at least in the House, could see some significant turnover. And the reason I say that, I guess all committees, you could say that about every committee in the House. We've got, you know, we will have a new Speaker of the House in 2019. And when that happens, the Speaker will name chairmen to the committees and the committee composition. And so who knows? It's a big variable today as to whether or not that committee will be made up of the same type of members or the same members themselves or have the same chairman. And that can certainly drive priorities and how those issues are analyzed. And I know that makes everybody in this room really comfortable. But that's the reality. We don't know what that'll look like. And so, again, that's something to kind of keep in mind. Last session, Chairman Larson and Chairman Perry, his counterpart, who's the chairman of the Senate Agriculture, Water, and Rural Affairs Committee, met on a regular basis. They carried a lot of each other's bills, but I think towards the end of the session, a lot of those bills weren't moving for one reason or the other in each chamber, and so that just didn't end up being, you know, I think what they had both hoped the outcome would be for a lot of their bills. And there's political reasons for that, probably at higher levels and other levels, other individuals involved. But the reality was a lot of those bills didn't pass, and the ones that did pass, a lot of them were vetoed. And so, you know, if there's different chairs, there's going to be a political dynamic to how those chairmen work with one another and whether or not they're able to pull together and pull the same direction for some of the water priorities that we see going forward. You know, I don't know if we'll see the same type of veto activity if they do. And so that's something that we'll need to look at, too. And then will there be enough political will to actually address some of these issues that have been mentioned on previous panels and what was discussed here earlier, and some of the issues I just raised that were, I think, the focus of the last session and will be the focus of future sessions. Hurricane Harvey relief and some of the issues that are still being sort of evaluated and analyzed, and the cost of responding to that appropriately still up in the air somewhat, I think is a big variable. And whether or not, you can get, for instance, 24 House members from Houston who have had all the water they want to focus on maybe some issues that would affect areas like, the Panhandle or parts of West Texas where, the drought is so significant. They may not think that that's a big priority. So that's just the reality. It is somewhat of a numbers game, but I think we could all, do with a clock like this to remind us from time to time of what it's going to look like in the future if we actually don't focus on some of these issues and continue to be innovative. So I heard Chairman King say that he'd answer the hard questions, and we got 5 minutes left or so, and I really appreciate y'all letting me join you today. Thank you.
Thank you.